My belief is that Madeleine McCann died in April or May 2007. I believe Madeleine McCann's corpse was situated in the McCann's holiday apartment for a period of time. I believe that Madeleine McCann's corpse was transported in the McCann's Renault Scenic hire car some weeks after she died. I believe there has been a high-level cover-up about what really happened.
Why would anyone alter a family photo? Why did the metadata vanish? And if Madeline was last seen at lunchtime on May 3rd, why can no one place her anywhere after Sunday, April 29th? In the disappearance of Madeleine McCann, the public has been told a story of abduction. But what if the abduction never happened, and the real timeline had already been rewritten days before the world even knew her name? On the night of May 3, 2007, a sudden scream shattered the calm of Praia da Luz. Kate McCann ran back to the tapas restaurant in a state of hysteria, shouting, "They've taken her." According to her testimony, this outcry came after she returned to apartment 5A for the third time that evening to check on her children. She claimed she found the bedroom window open, the curtain blowing in the breeze, and her 3-year-old daughter Madeline missing from bed. That moment would define the official story for the next 17 years. An unknown intruder had somehow entered a holiday apartment in southern Portugal and abducted a child while her parents dined less than 100 meters away. Within hours, international media seized the narrative. Headlines from BBC, Sky News, The Guardian echoed a consistent frame. Missing toddler feared abducted from Algarve resort. Madeline kidnapped as parents dined nearby. No one waited for forensic analysis. No one questioned the implausibility of an invisible kidnapper. The world, it seemed, had made up its mind before the investigation even began. But what if that mind was manipulated? As Richard D. Hall argues throughout his investigations, the public was never given the truth, it was given a script. And the script was riddled with contradictions, omissions, and fabrication. The deeper one looks, the more evident it becomes that the abduction story was not supported by a single piece of solid forensic evidence. Not one. At the heart of the mainstream tale lies the open bedroom window, supposedly the point of entry and exit for the phantom abductor. But as Hall meticulously demonstrates, this key detail crumbled under forensic scrutiny. There were no signs of forced entry. The window latch was intact. The glass was unbroken. More crucially, the only fingerprints found on the window belonged to Kate McCann. If an abductor had climbed through that window while carrying a child, it would be reasonable to expect signs of disturbance: scuff marks on the sill, fibers, partial prints, a trail. Yet nothing was found. No footprints on the flower bed below. No traces of dirt on the floor. No signs that anyone had entered from outside. Even the curtain's movement cited by Kate as the most dramatic evidence was later deemed physically implausible, as the shutters could not have been opened from the outside without leaving marks. According to Hall, the physical reality of apartment 5A contradicted the entire narrative. He calls it a staged scene, constructed to mimic an abduction, but never intended to withstand proper investigation. Perhaps the most damning contradictions came not from human witnesses, but from two dogs: Eddie, a cadaver dog, and Keela, a blood detection dog, both from South Yorkshire Police's elite K9 unit. Richard Hall's documentation of the dog's deployment is chilling. Eddie alerted to the scent of human decomposition in the following locations: behind the living room sofa, in the bedroom where Madeline slept, on Kate McCann's clothing, on the key fob of the Renault Scenic hire car, inside the boot of that same car Keela, trained to detect traces of blood invisible to the human eye, alerted in the same apartment areas, especially near tile grout, where Hall explains blood can seep and settle beneath the surface, undetectable without specialized dogs or chemical analysis. Most critically, neither dog ever alerted near the bedroom window, the alleged route of the intruder. Nor did they react to any other parts of the apartment's exterior. These animals are used in major murder investigations globally and have a remarkable accuracy rate. And yet, the mainstream press dismissed their findings, or worse, ignored them entirely. As Hall remarked in The True Story of Madeleine McCann, if dogs are wrong, why were they used in every other child death case in the UK? Why were they right in those cases but ignored in this one? Another glaring omission from the mainstream narrative is the complete absence of CCTV evidence. Not a single frame of surveillance footage shows an unknown man leaving with a child. Praia da Luz had cameras across key entry and exit points, yet no viable suspect was captured, no blurred figure, no hurried movement, no corroboration. For Richard Hall, this is yet another red flag. In a real abduction scenario, it is statistically implausible for a perpetrator to leave zero trace. The clean escape of a stranger through a window, across a street, and out of a resort without being seen by anyone or anything is, quite simply, a forensic fantasy. Despite being portrayed by UK media as incompetent or passive, the PJ conducted a thorough early investigation. Inspector Tavares de Almeida, in his official report from 2007, wrote, "The evidence suggests that Madeline died in the apartment and that the McCanns simulated an abduction." This internal document is rarely mentioned in British coverage, yet it offers a candid summary of what the physical evidence showed. There was no break-in. The front door was likely the actual access point, not the window. Madeline may have died earlier than May 3rd. The media campaign to find Madeline served more to distract than to discover. Richard D. Hall emphasizes that the real investigation was effectively blocked not by a lack of leads, but by the overwhelming pressure from UK diplomats, politicians, and press to keep the abduction story alive. To better grasp the vast disconnect between the media's portrayal and the actual forensic findings, Richard D. Hall presents a striking side-by-side breakdown in his documentary, When Madeline Died. The table is simple but devastating. It contrasts what the public was told with what investigators actually uncovered. For instance, while headlines repeated the claim that a kidnapper had forced open the bedroom window, forensic examination revealed no signs of forced entry, only Kate McCann's fingerprints on the frame. The front door, which was used regularly by the family and was likely the real point of access, was barely mentioned in any early reporting. Physical evidence was said to be absent because the abductor was a professional. Yet the truth is more uncomfortable. There was no trace of anyone other than the family. DNA. Not a single sample tied to an intruder was ever recovered, and while British media downplayed or ignored the cadaver and blood dog alerts, the dogs themselves reacted powerfully to areas and items associated directly with the McCanns. Even the Portuguese police, dismissed as inept by the UK press, had in fact produced a clear report that concluded Madeline had died in the apartment and the scene had been deliberately manipulated to stage an abduction. The difference between perception and reality, as Hall makes painfully clear, is not a matter of opinion but of evidence. In each of his documentaries, Hall returns to a single, unsettling question. If there is no trace of an abductor, no DNA, no prints, no sightings, no forensics, why does the world still believe one exists? His conclusion is unequivocal. The abduction narrative was manufactured, marketed, and maintained to shield a deeper, more disturbing truth. The media did not report the story, they participated in writing it. And in doing so, they helped bury the very evidence that might have led to justice for a 3-year-old girl named Madeline. Of all the images associated with the Madeleine McCann case, none has been more iconic or more controversial than the so-called last photo. According to the McCanns, this was the final picture taken of Madeline while she was alive, captured by her father Jerry on the afternoon of May 3, 2007, just hours before she reportedly vanished. The photo features Madeline, her younger sister Amelie, and Kate McCann sitting by the Ocean Club's pool in Praia da Luz. The sun is bright, the sky is blue, and the family appears relaxed. To the mainstream media, this image became a pillar of their narrative, a heart-wrenching glimpse into a serene moment, later shattered by an unthinkable crime. But to Richard D. Hall, the photo is anything but comforting. It is a calculated construction, he argues, and one that demands forensic scrutiny. One of the most striking red flags comes from the very source of light captured in the image. According to Hall's analysis, the angle of the sunlight and the placement of shadows indicate a time, well before 2:30 p.m., the hour Jerry McCann claimed the photo was taken. In the picture, shadows fall directly below the subjects, suggesting the sun was nearly overhead, which typically occurs around midday, not mid-afternoon. This inconsistency alone challenges the timeline. But Hall digs deeper. He questions why the photo, if it were truly taken at 2:29 p.m. on May 3, does not reflect the prevailing weather conditions recorded that day. Meteorological data from the Lagos weather station, just a short distance from Praia da Luz, confirms that May 3 was largely cloudy, breezy, and overcast. Yet the photo shows a crystal-clear blue sky, no cloud cover, and an intense brightness uncharacteristic of the conditions that afternoon. In his documentary, When Madeline Died, Hall juxtaposes this image with other photos taken by Tapas 7 members on May 2 and 3. All of them reflect the subdued light and gray skies described in weather reports. The poolside photo, by contrast, appears visibly sunnier, sharper, and more vibrant, creating a discord that cannot be explained away by chance. A key point in Hall's critique centers on the absence of EXIF data. EXIF metadata is automatically embedded in every digital photograph and contains critical information: the exact time and date the photo was taken, camera model, aperture settings, and sometimes even GPS coordinates. In the case of the last photo, however, all EXIF data was stripped before the image was released to the public. The McCanns claimed the original image had been transferred between devices and modified for publication, resulting in the metadata loss. But to Hall, this explanation falls flat. In his words, "This wasn't incidental, it was intentional tampering." You can't accidentally delete metadata multiple times across formats. What you're seeing is a sterilized image, an image that's been manually stripped of the very data that could validate or refute the story attached to it. The lack of EXIF data means there is no independent verification of when the photo was taken. For a picture that allegedly anchors the final moments of a missing child's life, this absence is far from trivial. It is, as Hall puts it, a photographic ghost with a fabricated timestamp. Further inconsistencies lie within the composition of the image itself. Hall conducts a detailed facial ratio analysis between Madeline, Amelie, and Kate. What he finds is concerning. Madeline appears noticeably older in this photo than in others from the same week. Her facial structure, especially her cheekbones and jawline, seems more developed, her posture stiffer. Critics of Hall have called this subjective analysis, but he responds with comparative frames from earlier photos, where Madeline looks smaller, rounder-faced, and physically more juvenile. These comparisons raise the possibility that the last photo may not have been taken on May 3rd at all, but several days earlier, when Madeline was still visibly at ease and healthy. This visual discrepancy feeds into a broader, more ominous theory. Was this photo backdated to cover a gap in the real timeline? If the photo doesn't match the weather, lighting, or facial proportions of early May, then when was it taken? Richard D. Hall presents a compelling case for April 29, 2007 as the true date of the image. According to resort logs, that was the first day the McCanns used the Ocean Club pool area. It was also the only day during their stay that featured clear skies, strong sunlight, and favorable temperatures, conditions that align exactly with what is seen in the photo. Moreover, no other image released by the McCanns or the Tapas 7 from April 30 through May 3 displays similar weather conditions. If Madeline had indeed been by the pool on May 3rd, where are the other photos? Why is this the only surviving image of her from that day, especially in a world saturated with digital cameras and vacation snapshots? Even more suspicious is the silence surrounding the days that followed April 29. From April 30 until May 3, there are no confirmed photographs of Madeleine McCann alive. Hall finds this 4-day blackout deeply troubling, a void that was later filled by one image, an image that appears too convenient, too clean, too well-timed. If the last known photo of Madeline was actually taken on April 29th, not May 3, Hall asks, then what really happened to her in the days in between? This is the question that haunts his investigation. If the last photo was recycled from an earlier date, then it becomes part of a larger fabrication effort, one that restructured the timeline to support an abduction narrative that may never have occurred. In this scenario, Madeline's death could have taken place between April 29 and May 2. Her parents, realizing the consequences, may have constructed an elaborate cover-up, choosing to anchor their defense on an emotionally powerful image. By releasing the photo after Madeline was gone and claiming it was taken on the same day she disappeared, they gave investigators and the world a misleading timestamp to build upon. And if the date is false, then the official narrative collapses. There is no longer a verifiable timeline. There is no longer a last seen alive moment. The entire foundation of the May 3rd abduction claim becomes legally and investigatively void. Richard D. Hall does not merely question the authenticity of the last photo. He dismantles it. Through light analysis, weather reports, metadata irregularities, and logical deduction, he presents the image not as proof but as propaganda. You can lie with words, Hall concludes. But when you start lying with photographs, especially one that's meant to anchor an entire timeline, then the deception is no longer personal. It's strategic. To Hall, the last photo is not just a manipulated image. It is a keystone of a constructed reality, designed not to illuminate what happened to Madeline, but to obscure it. In Richard D. Hall's investigative documentaries, particularly When Madeline Died, one of the most controversial, yet crucial exercises he undertakes is to reconstruct the timeline of events in the days leading up to Madeleine McCann's disappearance. This 6-day window, from April 28 to May 3, forms the fragile backbone of the official narrative. But through forensic gaps, visual inconsistencies, and testimonies often overlooked by the media, Hall builds a compelling argument that what we were told about those days may be significantly different from what actually occurred. April 28 arrival in Praia da Luz. The McCann family checked into apartment 5EA at the Ocean Club Resort in Praia da Luz, Portugal. This marked the beginning of their family holiday and the beginning of a timeline that would soon spiral into global infamy. Yet despite the significance of their arrival, there are no public photos, videos, or independent witness confirmations of the McCanns or Madeline on this day. Hall points out that this absence of documentation, while not necessarily suspicious in isolation, sets a tone for what will become a worrying trend in the following days: missing images, missing timestamps, and missing context. April 29, the day of the pool. According to Ocean Club records, April 29 was the first day the McCanns used the pool facilities. The weather on this day was markedly sunny, the only day that week with strong, direct sunlight and clear skies. This meteorological detail matters because of one specific image, the so-called last photo. Claimed by Jerry McCann to have been taken at 2:29 p.m. on May 3, the photograph shows Madeline, Kate McCann, and her twin sister Amelie sitting poolside in the sun. But Hall, after analyzing the angle of shadows, sky conditions, and light intensity, argues that this photo could not have been taken on May 3. Instead, all signs suggest it was taken on April 29. There are no known surveillance images, Crechi records, or witness accounts confirming Madeline's activities that day beyond her parents' own claims. No CCTV footage corroborates the timing or location of the photo. Hall's conclusion is that the photograph may have been strategically retained and later used to reinforce a false timeline. April 30, the image blackout begins. From this point onward, Hall highlights an alarming and uninterrupted 4-day visual gap: no verified images, no confirmed sightings, no independent documentation of Madeleine McCann being alive. On April 30, there is no public photo of Madeline, no verifiable Crechi attendance records, no independent witnesses confirming her presence. In Hall's estimation, this day may have marked the beginning of a concealed period of void during which, if anything had happened to Madeline, it could have been hidden, covered up, or ignored. May 1, the crying incident, one of the most underreported yet crucial events in the reconstructed timeline, comes from Mrs. Pamela Fenn, a local resident living in the apartment directly above 5A. In her formal statement, Fenn said that on the night of May 1, she heard a child crying in apartment 5A for over an hour, beginning around 10:30 p.m., and continuing until just before midnight. She reported hearing no comforting voice, no adult presence, and no indication that anyone attended to the child. The next morning, Fenn received no inquiry from the McCanns or anyone else about the noise. She later expressed concern that no one seemed to acknowledge or address the incident. To Hall, this is more than an anecdote. It is potentially the last known evidence that Madeline was alive. If it was indeed Madeline crying, the fact that she was left unattended and distressed challenges the narrative of attentive, cautious parenting. If the crying child wasn't Madeline, then who was it? Hall argues that the McCanns twins were too young to wail for over an hour, at that intensity, without drawing attention. The unanswered questions around this event leave a deeply unsettling possibility. Was this the last night Madeline was alive? May 2, still no trace. The following day continues the pattern. On May 2, there are no images of Madeline, no confirmed sightings from Kretchy staff or resort guests, no independent security footage. Even more concerning, Hall notes that Kretchy records from this period contain irregularities. Some entries appear altered. The handwriting on certain dates is inconsistent, and there are questions about the authenticity of Kate McCann's signature. Hall and other independent researchers propose that May 2 may have been a critical day for staging, a time to adjust documents, prepare explanations, and align the TAPA 7 statements to fit the eventual claim of abduction on May 3. May 3, the official day of disappearance. According to the mainstream narrative, this was the day Madeleine McCann disappeared. 8:30 a.m. Kate McCann reportedly drops Madeline off at the Ocean Club's Kretch. 12:30 p.m. Jerry McCann is said to have picked her up. 2:29 p.m. Jerry claims to have taken the last photo at the pool. However, Hall dismantles each of these touch points. No independent image confirms Madeline's Kretchy attendance that day. No security camera confirms her presence anywhere. The last photo, allegedly taken that afternoon, lacks EXF metadata and does not match the day's weather conditions, which were overcast and gray, not sunny. That evening, around 10 p.m., Kate McCann raises the alarm, running to the tapas bar and shouting, "They've taken her." Thus begins the abduction narrative. But by this point, Hall argues, the damage to the timeline has already been done. There are no photographs, no CCTV, and no eyewitnesses who saw Madeline after midday on April 29. Every point thereafter is based solely on the statements of individuals who had a vested interest in affirming a particular sequence of events. From April 28 to May 3, a troubling pattern emerges, one that Richard D. Hall identifies as a deliberate blackout of verifiable evidence surrounding Madeleine McCann's presence. On April 28, the day the McCanns arrived in Praia da Luz, there were no photographs of Madeline, no independent witnesses who saw her, and no CCTV or resort records documenting her whereabouts. The following day, April 29, is potentially the date when the now famous last photo was taken, though no witness or security footage supports this timeline. On April 30, the blackout begins in full: no photo, no witness, and no resort data confirming Madeline's existence. By May 1, the only documented event comes from Mrs. Pamela Fenn, who reported hearing a child crying for over an hour in the apartment above hers, but once again, there are no images or official records to contextualize it. The silence continues into May 2, with no evidence whatsoever placing Madeline anywhere. On May 3, the official day of her disappearance, the disputed last photo is said to have been taken, yet no independent witness saw Madeline, and no camera captured her that day. Hall argues that this 6-day gap in the record is no coincidence, but rather a red flag, a strategic absence that calls the official narrative into question. From Hall's perspective, the official timeline was not simply flawed, it was fabricated. He argues that Madeline likely died suddenly on April 29 or 30, possibly due to an accident or medical event. The last photo was held back and presented after the fact to anchor a new timeline. Kretchy records were altered, and statements were synchronized among the Tapas 7 to construct a believable version of May 3. The entire period from April 30 to May 3, he contends, was used to design a cover story, not to locate a missing child. If Madeline was last seen on April 29, Then what happened in the next 96 hours wasn't a search, it was a staging. Hall concludes. In this reconstructed timeline, each day is not simply part of a holiday gone wrong, but potentially a step in a calculated sequence to mislead investigators, shape public perception, and preserve reputations. For Hall, this isn't just about Madeline's disappearance, it's about truth erased by narrative. When analyzing the disappearance of Madeleine McCann, Richard D. Hall does not begin with headlines or interviews. He begins with silence, specifically the absence of forensic alignment between the mainstream narrative and the physical reality. At the core of this discrepancy stand two trained dogs, Eddie, a cadaver detection dog, and Keela, trained to detect traces of human blood. Their findings are among the most objective data points in a case plagued by speculation. Yet, Hall argues, their alerts were systematically ignored not because they were unreliable, but because they did not fit the story. According to operational footage and expert commentary from Martin Grime, the professional handler who worked with both dogs, the alerts were neither random nor ambiguous. They followed a precise trajectory, one that, in Hall's view, draws a forensic map that authorities have chosen to erase. In the bedroom where Madeline was last seen, Eddie gave a clear and intense reaction: the location. The corner at the foot of the bed, the very place Madeline was said to have slept. This was the only cadaver alert in that room, indicating the possible presence of a decomposing body or item contaminated by such scent. Next, Eddie alerted strongly near a cupboard in the living room. This was not a bedroom, not a high-traffic area, yet it triggered a cadaver reaction. Hall highlights this as a potential temporary holding area, one perhaps used in panic or during a staged cleanup. The alert here suggests movement, concealment, and intent. Among the personal belongings tested, one of Kate McCann's jackets prompted an alert from Eddie. The garment was isolated in a separate room. While this does not directly implicate the wearer, Hall raises a critical question. How does the scent of death attach itself to clothing, unless there was proximity to a decomposing body? Perhaps most damning are the alerts involving the Renault Scenic, a rental car acquired 24 days after Madeline disappeared. Both dogs reacted. Eddie signaled cadaver scent near the trunk area. Keela identified human blood traces in the same spot. Subsequent testing revealed a partial DNA profile matching 15 of 19 markers with Madeleine McCann. Hall underscores that while this fell short of legal sufficiency, it was forensically disturbing. If not her, then who? If her, then how? Hall dedicates considerable time to educating viewers on the scientific plausibility behind the dog's performance. This is not sentiment. It is chemistry and biophysics. When surfaces are cleaned with water, especially porous materials like ceramic tile, blood and scent molecules do not vanish. They sink deeper, below the visible layer, settling into subflooring and grout. Over time, due to expansion and contraction from temperature fluctuations, microscopic gaps form perfect hiding spots for trace elements. It is in these hidden zones that Keela alerted to blood, not on the surface, but beneath the floor. Hall emphasizes no equipment currently available to police can replicate this level of sensitivity. The dogs, in this case, outperformed all lab tools, and yet their findings were discarded. Why were the alerts ignored? This is where Hall's analysis becomes most pointed. The dogs did their job. They identified what no one else could. But instead of pursuing these leads, the authorities chose to minimize, sideline, and ultimately dismiss the alerts altogether. Hall points to a striking double standard in British and American law enforcement. In Florida, a mother was prosecuted after a cadaver dog alerted to the trunk of her car. The case proceeded even without a body. In numerous, no-body homicides, dog alerts are not only admissible but central to conviction. Yet here, in what has become one of the most expensive missing child cases in history, the alerts of Eddie and Keela were deemed insufficient to warrant further legal action. The reason given by UK officials: that dog evidence alone is not conclusive. Hall does not accept this explanation at face value. In his view, the alerts were not invalid. They were inconvenient. Their implications clashed directly with the official narrative of a stranger abduction through an open window, a narrative that had already been broadcast worldwide. Richard D. Hall coins the term selective forensics to describe this phenomenon. In this case, science was only welcomed when it supported the narrative. When it didn't, it was buried. He views the silencing of Eddie and Keela's alerts as a form of political interference, not just legal oversight. The McCanns were backed by British governmental figures, had direct media access, and launched a multi-million-pound campaign supported by UK institutions. A forensic discovery that placed a dead body in their apartment, or worse. Their car would have shattered public trust, implicated high-ranking officials, and undermined the credibility of Operation Grange, the UK's police task force dedicated to finding Madeline. Thus, Hall concludes, the dogs were not wrong. They were too right. Despite Martin Grimes' credentials and the credibility of his dogs, no re-examination of apartment 5A occurred. No second round of canine deployment. No new forensic collection. Instead, the alerts were quietly archived, mentioned in passing, and ultimately rendered irrelevant. From Hall's viewpoint, this was the true forensic crime, not what was found, but what was buried. Eddie and Keela's alerts suggest more than missed clues. They imply a different timeline, one where Madeline may have died in the apartment, her body possibly moved in the rented vehicle weeks later. Hall does not declare this as conclusive fact, but he argues that no reasonable investigation would have ignored this trail. He concludes with a line that summarizes his entire approach. Forensics are supposed to lead the story, not follow it. In the case of Madeleine McCann, the dogs told a story that was too honest, too grounded, and too unflattering to those in power. And so, it was silenced not in the streets, but in the files. One of the most persistent features of the Madeleine McCann case is the recurring stream of sightings that dominated media cycles for years. Each of these sightings was introduced as a possible breakthrough, only to dissolve into silence without charges, forensic backing, or meaningful follow-up. Richard D. Hall, in his multi-part documentaries, methodically deconstructs these accounts, revealing them not as organic witness reports, but as strategic components in upholding the abduction narrative. Four figures stand out in particular: Tanner Man, Smith Man, Sagres Man, and Crashman. Jane Tanner, a member of the Tapas 7 group, claimed to have seen a man crossing the street with a child in pajamas at approximately 9:15 p.m. on the evening of May 3, 2007. This was a critical time shortly after Madeline was said to have been last seen alive, and before Kate McCann raised the alarm. The location of this alleged sighting is problematic. Jane described the man as walking right past the side of apartment 5A, the same spot where Jerry McCann was speaking to another guest, Jess Wilkins. Remarkably, neither Jerry nor Jess reported seeing anyone fitting the description that Jane provided. If a man carrying a child had passed just feet away from them, unnoticed, it raises serious questions about the plausibility of the account. Furthermore, Jane Tanner's description was exceedingly vague. The man wore light-colored trousers, but she could not recall any distinguishing features: no clear view of the face, no hair color, height estimate, or gait description. It was, in essence, a ghost sketch of a figure too faint to pursue in any forensic sense. Richard D. Hall asks the logical question: if Jane Tanner truly saw a stranger carrying a child in the direction of an open apartment window, why did she not intervene, alert someone, or even express concern that night? Why wait until the following day, after the media frenzy had begun? Hall posits that the Tanner Man sighting served a clear purpose: to introduce the idea of an abduction early, before any contrary forensic evidence could take hold in the public mind. He believes this was the first of many media diversions. At approximately 10 p.m. on May 3, the Smith family Irish tourists walking home from dinner reported seeing a man carrying a child in his arms. This account is often referred to as the Smith sighting, and initially garnered little attention. Martin Smith, the family patriarch, admitted at first that he could not positively identify the man. However, several months later, After seeing news footage of Jerry McCann disembarking a plane with one of his twins, Martin reported that the man's posture and gait closely resembled Jerry's. This revelation was significant and troubling. If the man the Smiths saw was Jerry, it would mean Madeline had not been abducted by a stranger at all, but instead carried away by her own father. Despite this, UK media outlets largely ignored Martin Smith's amended statement. Scotland Yard did not publicly pursue the lead. Operation Grange, tasked with reinvestigating the case from 2011 onward, briefly included the Smith sighting in a televised appeal, but only to reinterpret it as irrelevant or mistaken. To Hall, this was no coincidence. Of all the sightings, the Smith sighting posed the greatest risk to the official narrative. Its details matched the timeline, and the witness, unlike Tanner, had no ties to the McCanns. That it was so systematically buried is, in Hall's view, the clearest sign that this case is not merely about evidence, but about controlling the public perception of that evidence. In 2007, a man from Germany vacationing in the town of Sagres, not far from Praia da Luz, was labeled a potential suspect after he was reportedly seen near the Ocean Club. His name, photograph, and personal details were widely published in newspapers, like the Sun and Daily Mail, under headlines implying possible involvement. No charges were ever brought against the man. He was later proven to have no connection whatsoever to the disappearance of Madeleine McCann. His only crime was being in the wrong place at the wrong time and perhaps looking unusual enough to stir suspicion. Hall criticizes the media's role in this incident. The suspect, dubbed Sagres Man, was sacrificed on the altar of public curiosity. In Hall's words, he became the scapegoat of the weak, allowing newspapers to maintain the illusion of progress while distracting from real inconsistencies in the case. The lesson here, Hall suggests, is not about justice, but about optics. Creating an enemy, even a false one, is useful when the truth is too dangerous or inconvenient to pursue. In 2013, 6 years after the disappearance, DCI Andy Redwood of Operation Grange revealed a new suspect during a high-profile BBC Crime Watch broadcast. This man, who had never come forward before, was said to be a vacationing parent who had retrieved his own child from the Crocker HE and was mistakenly identified by Jane Tanner. According to Redwood, this individual had been eliminated as a suspect, and his presence now explained away the Tanner sighting. Suddenly, Tanner Man had been solved. But for Hall, this resolution raised more questions than it answered. Why did it take 6 years to identify a man who, if innocent, could have come forward immediately? Why had Jane Tanner not recognized this fellow parent at the time? And more fundamentally, if Tanner Man had been an error all along, why was the entire narrative of an abduction built largely on her account never reconsidered? Hall views the emergence of Crashman as a retroactive correction to a foundational error. Rather than admit that Tanner's story was flawed from the start, the investigation instead introduced a placeholder, a faceless father figure who could mop up the inconsistencies without threatening the central premise. Hall asserts that none of these individuals were ever real suspects. Instead, each one played a tactical role in preserving the myth of abduction. Each of these individuals served a specific purpose in the media game. None were ever seriously investigated or charged, but all helped prop up the abduction narrative at various stages of public interest. Tanner Man provided the initial seed for the kidnapping theory. Smith Man was quietly suppressed due to the implication it may have been Jerry McCann. Sagres Man was a media scapegoat, a decoy to divert public attention. Crashman allowed the narrative to be cleaned up without implicating anyone internally. Hall's final judgment is chillingly precise. When a case has 4 suspects who vanish into thin air without charges, it's not a sign of weak evidence, it's a sign the suspects were never meant to be real. These phantoms, as Hall calls them, didn't help solve the case, they helped obscure it. Their role wasn't to uncover truth, but to anchor a story that could be fed to the public while the real answers remained locked behind institutional silence. In any high-profile investigation, the consistency of witness testimony is typically viewed as a positive indicator of truth. But when that consistency endures for nearly 2 decades, remains immune to contradiction, and survives without a single deviation from any member of a large group, one must ask, is this genuine memory, or is it coordinated narrative? This question lies at the heart of Richard D. Hall's suspicion toward the Tapas 7, the 7 friends who dined with Jerry and Kate McCann on the night of May 3, 2007, in Praia da Luz. Hall applies the lens of group memory contamination, a psychological phenomenon in which individuals unconsciously conform their recollections to align with a dominant narrative shared within a group. Over time, they begin to remember not what they personally experienced, but what the group collectively reinforced. In the McCann case, the Tapas 7 maintained an unusually stable story that they all had dinner at the Tapas restaurant and took turns checking on their children, including Madeline, every 15 to 30 minutes. This story has remained virtually unchanged since it was first given to the Portuguese police in 2007. Despite some initial discrepancies, by 2008 the statements from each member aligned with uncanny precision, so much so that Hall refers to it as narrative engineering. The level of uniformity, he argues, feels less like honest recollection and more like mutual reinforcement. A major point of contention is the so-called timeline of child checks, the supposed rotation system by which each adult would leave the table to inspect their own children. According to various testimonies, someone checked at 9:05 p.m., another at 9:15 p.m. Yet somehow they never crossed paths in the narrow walkway leading to the apartments. Jane Tanner, for instance, claims to have passed Jerry McCann during her check and witnessed a man walking with a child. Jerry claims he was at that same location speaking with a neighbor but didn't see anyone. Hall points out how implausible it is that 2 adults, mere feet apart, would not see one another or a man allegedly carrying a child. Furthermore, Hall highlights that no CCTV footage, no independent eyewitness, and no verified photographs support this alleged routine. It is a story that lives only in the mouths of its tellers. Perhaps more troubling than the internal contradictions is the fact that not one member of the Tapas 7 has deviated from the agreed-upon narrative since 2007. In other major criminal cases, witnesses evolve, revise, or retract their accounts. Memories falter. Doubts creep in. But in this case, the wall has held firm. Even those who came under scrutiny, such as Jane Tanner, whose Tanner Man sighting became a focal point of media confusion, or Matthew Oldfield, who allegedly entered the apartment but didn't see Madeline, have never once altered their testimony. David Payne, subject of considerable speculation in other parts of Hall's documentary work, has also remained entirely silent. So why hasn't anyone broken ranks? Hall proposes that the answer lies in a strategic pact of silence. This isn't merely about shared memory, it is about mutual survival. This is not just group memory. Hall states in When Madeline Died, it's strategic memory. According to Hall, a tacit agreement among the Tapas 7 may have emerged not necessarily to cover up a murder, but to protect careers, families, and reputations. Most members of the group are medical professionals with a great deal to lose. A single contradiction could collapse the entire narrative structure and expose all of them to scrutiny, if not legal liability. Some may fear being implicated in negligence, having left children unattended while dining and drinking. Others may fear something more sinister, that one or more among them knows the truth, but cannot speak it without risking their own future or safety. Hall poses a rhetorical question to drive this point home. A small lie may survive a few days. A big lie involving multiple professionals rarely survives 17 years, unless it's protected. In Hall's view, this protection comes not only from within the group, but from external institutional support. The Portuguese police initially flagged the Tapas 7's inconsistencies, but those red flags were soon buried under a tidal wave of diplomatic pressure and media redirection. From early in the case, the UK government intervened in unusual ways, sending embassy officials, delaying document releases, and even refusing to fully cooperate with Portuguese authorities. The Tapas 7 were eventually invited back to Portugal in 2008 for a reenactment and questioning. not one of them returned. Hall interprets this as a deliberate evasion, protected by powerful actors who feared the consequences of unraveling the narrative. The British press, meanwhile, chose not to highlight internal inconsistencies or reinvestigate the statements. Instead, they painted the group as loyal friends, helping two grieving parents search for their child. Hall calls this the immunity of consensus. The result is what Hall labels passive collusion, not an overt conspiracy, but a form of unspoken agreement to not break the silence. This form of complicity, he argues, is more dangerous than direct criminality because it makes truth impossible to extract. Some members may genuinely believe they're doing the right thing by staying silent. Others may be acting out of fear or legal advice. But the effect is the same, a near impenetrable wall of testimony that supports the abduction narrative. Even as the forensic evidence, or lack thereof, tells a different story. Hall does not accuse all members of Tapas 7 of wrongdoing. But he is adamant that their unwavering consistency is not the natural result of memory. It is the result of intention, passive collusion. Hall says, is where silence becomes a weapon and loyalty becomes complicity. What began as a story of parental heartbreak evolved into a state-sanctioned tragedy in which truth was sacrificed for narrative stability. The Tapas 7 became part of that system, whether willingly or by coercion. Hall does not believe that silence is neutral. In his eyes, when a case has dozens of unanswered questions, broken timelines, no forensic trace of a stranger, and not one friend willing to challenge the script, then silence is no longer silence, it is part of the story itself. And until someone inside that circle dares to speak, the truth about Madeline's fate will remain locked not in evidence, but in memory, and memory, as Hall has shown, is the easiest thing to rewrite. In any investigation involving high-profile suspects, the forensic evidence often speaks volumes. But so too does the language used by those under suspicion. In the case of Madeleine McCann, where physical evidence remains elusive, independent analyst Peter Hyatt turns to a different kind of clue: the embedded confession. His thesis is both simple and profound. People don't always confess intentionally, but their words often do it for them. An embedded confession is not a direct admission of guilt. Rather, it is a statement that, when analyzed closely, leaks elements of the truth, often unintentionally. Hyatt, an expert in statement analysis, argues that when a person lies, their brain is forced to juggle multiple layers of reality: what happened, what others know, what they want to hide, and what they want others to believe. In that chaos, fragments of truth can slip out in the structure of their speech, in the words they emphasize, or in the odd phrasing they use. Hyatt explains, the brain seeks to tell the truth. Deception is a cognitive burden. And so, when people lie, especially about something traumatic, their language often betrays them. In his detailed analysis of Kate and Jerry McCann's public statements, Hyatt identifies multiple linguistic leaks, moments where their carefully constructed narrative appears to falter. In these cracks, he sees the outlines of a different story. According to multiple sources, the first words Kate McCann reportedly uttered when discovering Madeline missing were, "They've taken her." This phrase, seemingly shouted as she returned to the apartment, has been widely cited in media coverage. But to Hyatt, it signals more than shock, it raises profound questions. Why did Kate immediately conclude Madeline had been taken? Why did she not first say, "She's gone. Where is she?" Or even, "Madeline is missing"? These would be natural expressions of confusion or fear. Instead, she spoke with absolute certainty and with an identified subject, they. Hyatt highlights this moment as a classic example of preloaded narrative. To assert abduction immediately, he says, without evidence of forced entry or eyewitnesses, is to indicate prior knowledge, not discovery. The use of they introduces a vague, faceless antagonist, but it also conveniently shifts focus away from the speaker and preempts any alternative theories. To Hall and Hyatt, this statement was not a cry for help. It was the opening line of a constructed explanation. One of Jerry McCann's most repeated phrases is, "There's no evidence Madeline came to harm." At first glance, this sounds like optimism. But Hyatt deconstructs the sentence differently. He notes that the statement is framed in the negative, what is not known, rather than in the positive. "We believe she is alive." This subtle choice matters. "There's no evidence" avoids the issue of what the speaker believes. It introduces legal language, not emotional conviction. Furthermore, the use of "came to harm" is passive. It avoids attributing agency. No one hurt her, rather, harm somehow arrived. Hyatt remarks, this is not the language of hope. This is the language of legal shielding. It prepares the audience for the possibility of harm, while denying the burden of proof. It's distancing, strategic, and cold. To Richard D. Hall, such phrasing signals not innocence, but media coaching statements built around plausible deniability, not emotional truth. When asked in an interview about the cadaver and blood detection dogs Eddie and Keela, and their startling alerts inside apartment 5A and the McCanns' rental car, Jerry McCann reportedly replied, "Ask the dogs." For Hyatt, this sarcastic quip is deeply revealing. Rather than confront the results which suggested the presence of a cadaver in multiple McCann-associated locations, Jerry sidestepped. He didn't deny the dogs' accuracy. He didn't question their reliability. He delegated the question to them in a flippant tone. Hyatt categorizes this as linguistic deflection, a mechanism people use when faced with uncomfortable truths. He's aware of what the dogs indicated, Hyatt says. But instead of addressing the science or its implications, he introduces sarcasm. That's not what the innocent do. Richard Hall goes even further, calling this moment a reflexive leakage, a verbal release of internal tension. He couldn't keep the mask up, Hall says. The words escaped through the cracks in his composure. Across hundreds of interviews, television appearances, and press briefings, one sentence remains conspicuously absent from the McCanns' lips. Wood did not kill Madeline. To Hyatt, this is the most damning silence of all. Innocent people, he argues, instinctively and repeatedly deny allegations with clarity and force. They say, "I didn't do it." That's not true. I would never. But the McCanns speak in abstractions. We love her. We would never harm her. She means everything to us. Such statements are persuasive, not declarative. They seek to generate sympathy, not deliver factual denial. Hyatt puts it bluntly, this is not a denial. This is persuasion. And persuasion is unnecessary if one is telling the truth. Peter Hyatt does not accuse. He analyzes language. And in the case of Kate and Jerry McCann, he finds that language to be troubling. Their words betray them. He concludes, they've told us the truth. They just haven't said it in the way most people expect. It's hidden beneath the layers of their own words. Richard D. Hall shares this view. In his documentary Embedded Confessions, Hall presents Hyatt's findings not as speculative, but as forensic psychological forensics, rendered through syntax and subconscious phrasing. Hyatt offers a chilling final note. Language reveals the truth long before forensics catches up. In a case filled with misdirection, red herrings, and narrative control, perhaps it is in the words, not the evidence, that the truth has been waiting all along. When a 3-year-old girl vanishes from a seaside resort in Portugal, it should be a case for the police, the courts, and eventually truth. But in the disappearance of Madeleine McCann, something else happened. The search for a child became a global PR campaign. Forensic findings were buried. Investigators were sidelined. And in their place, a narrative was manufactured and aggressively protected by some of the most powerful institutions in the UK. At the center of this machinery was Clarence Mitchell. Clarence Mitchell was not just any spokesperson. He was a former director of the UK government's Central Office of Information, a senior figure who once worked directly for the Prime Minister. After Madeleine's disappearance, he was reassigned unusually to become the full-time media handler for the McCann family. In British history, few private citizens have received such high-level government communications support. Mitchell's role was not limited to fielding press questions. He became the architect of the global message. The McCanns were innocent victims. Madeline had been abducted, and all efforts should focus on finding Madeline. This mantra was echoed worldwide. According to investigator Richard D. Hall, Clarence Mitchell's position was strategic. He wasn't simply managing public perception, he was engineering it. Any forensic inconsistencies, conflicting witness testimonies, or signs of potential wrongdoing by the parents were either dismissed, suppressed, or overshadowed by a polished media campaign. The goal: keep the abduction narrative dominant, regardless of the evidence. Among the most troubling elements in the case were the forensic indicators that something had gone very wrong inside apartment 5A, where Madeline was last seen. Two specially trained British dogs, Eddie and Keela, reacted strongly in the McCanns' rental apartment and later, their car. Eddie alerted to the scent of human decomposition behind a sofa and in a wardrobe. Keela indicated blood traces beneath the tiles. Later, DNA samples from the trunk of the McCanns' Renault Scenic matched 15 of 19 markers with Madeline. In most homicide or missing person cases, this would have triggered an immediate forensic inquiry. But not here. British police dismissed the findings as inconclusive. The Foreign Office reportedly pressured Portuguese investigators to scale down their suspicion of the parents. Crucial forensic reports by Martin Grime, the dog's handler, were never allowed into open court. Richard Hall insists this was no accident. The problem wasn't the lack of evidence, he says. The problem was that the evidence didn't fit the narrative. The phrase, "not enough evidence to prosecute," became a legal shield used not to reflect scientific uncertainty, but to strategically bury it. The presence of government actors in a private criminal investigation would be unusual unless the stakes were high. In the McCann case, the involvement of MI5, the Foreign Office, and high-ranking diplomatic officials points to an unprecedented level of political protection. The British ambassador arrived in Praia da Luz within days of Madeline's disappearance. MI5 allegedly compiled their own internal reports, which remain classified, and when Scotland Yard opened Operation Grange, their mandate shockingly was not to explore all theories, but only to examine the abduction angle. As Hall points out, this wasn't support. It was control. The narrative was being narrowed and fortified, making it virtually impossible for alternative theories, no matter how evidence-based, to gain ground. From 2007 to the present, British media outlets such as the BBC, Sky News, and Daily Mail have almost exclusively echoed the official story that Madeline was kidnapped by a stranger. No credible investigative outlets in the mainstream seriously pursued the forensic anomalies or explored inconsistencies in the McCanns' timeline. Instead, those who questioned the parents' role, including Portuguese lead investigator Gonçalo Amaral, were vilified in the press. Amaral's book, The Truth of the Lie, which suggested Madeline may have died in the apartment, was banned for years and led to a drawn-out legal battle. Simultaneously, the Find Madeline PR campaign rolled on. Pictures of Madeline circulated globally. New suspects were announced at regular intervals, none ever charged. The campaign kept the public engaged, but never closer to resolution. Richard Hall calls it a professionally orchestrated PR shield. The result was an information ecosystem where truth could not survive only what was permitted. Richard D. Hall, one of the few independent investigators to challenge the official line, puts it bluntly: Madeleine McCann died on or around April 29, 2007. He asserts that key officials, and perhaps even media leaders, knew this early on. But acknowledging her death and the possibility that it occurred inside apartment 5A would have shattered the constructed story. It would have implicated not just a grieving family, but possibly exposed a cover-up involving government actors, diplomats, and law enforcement agencies. Instead of facing that possibility, Hall believes the system chose self-preservation. This wasn't a matter of proving who did it, he says. It was about making sure the public never even asked. What the McCann case reveals, according to Hall, is more than individual corruption. It reveals institutional complicity, a machinery of government, media, An intelligence services capable of crafting and protecting a single narrative while silencing everything else. A family became untouchable. A message became sacred. Dissent became conspiracy. Hall asks a chilling question. If a government can shield a family from investigation in the death of a child, what else can it control? In this case, no new evidence was required, just control over the story. Richard D. Hall closes his investigation with a warning and a plea. The cost of silence is always greater than the discomfort of truth. When societies prioritize comfort over accountability, truth becomes collateral damage. Justice becomes a PR slogan. And victims like Madeline are lost not only to crime, but to history. If the world had simply accepted what was said, without examining what was done, we would never have seen the cracks. Hall insists that questioning the narrative is not disrespectful, it is necessary. Because if power can control the story of one child's death, it can control far more. And that, more than anything, is why Madeline's case must not be forgotten.